Have you guys tested out this Ruby Amber deck at all? I know one of my members, Patrick A, mentioned in the deck profile that he took this into hardcore and didn't lose a single match. So, really good to hear. Glad that we can get some more testing in and get a bigger sample size on this deck, because the more I use it, the more I really do like it. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Snow White portion of this engine in the Ruby Amber deck, because I didn't really showcase that in my first gameplay video. I focused around the aerial and the songs and the low to mid-range package with the damage and the healing. But utilizing Snow White in certain scenarios, especially against mid-range decks where that can really generate you very specific kinds of advantage, is extremely strong. So the one thing I like about this deck is that it does seem very adaptable. You saw how we played against like a Ruby focused removal deck like the Ruby Sapphire, a ramp deck as well, against discard in the Emerald Amber discard deck. And now you're going to see us go up against basically a set 4 adaptation of the Atlanta Lorcana Challenge winners deck, Joshua's Amber Amethyst with Perdita, Mufasa, and Fairy Godmother. So we likely are not going to get anything off that Bare Necessities. Instead of singing it with Snow White, we opt to ink it there and just drop another Mulan so that we're ready for the Rapunzel draw 2 next turn, assuming our board doesn't get outed, which is very unlikely. So we play this matchup a little bit slower, because in these control-oriented matchups here, we don't need to focus around dodging removal or playing for follow-up, and we don't have to worry about like our hand getting discarded or anything like that, right? So like I said, the deck seems pretty adaptable. Now this was a misplay, questing with both Mulan and Snow White, because I probably want to preserve the Snow White, so I probably should not have quested with that, because yeah, turn 3 the Mim Fox comes down and takes out thankfully the Mulan and not the Snow White. But yeah, your Snow White is potentially one of your more valuable resources, because it is the shift target for the Well-Wisher Snow White, and you do really want that shift in order to get the effect off right away. So we're going to drop the Rapunzel, heal the Mulan, draw 2, crash the Mulan that was healed into the Mim Fox to out it, and then throw the Snow White into the Pascal, which clears the opponent's board, keeps us with our Snow White, and we can definitely shift the bigger Snow White, which we just draw into there if needed, and we'll only have 1 damage on the new Snow White. The opponent puts down a Dolores, which is a very interesting card here. It allows them to draw when I have an exerted character, so a really good option, a 3/3 body that quests for 2. But we're going to once again set up for another Rapunzel draw here, because again, we know in this particular matchup against Amber Amethyst, we can afford to play a little bit slow. We don't have to worry about our beast getting like brawled or ice blocked down and Sisu'd or Madame Medusa or anything like that. We can afford to play it a little bit slower. Yes, they could drop like a Pinocchio or something and then crash their Madrigal into it, but that's very unlikely. Instead, they're going to go ahead and drop a Mufasa on turn 5, and that's a pretty strong play, right? Mufasa always represents great value when he comes down. We draw into a second Snow White, and we're just going to hold off on it again and focus on generating this card advantage, see where we're at, and then play from there. So we're going to ink the Snow White that we drew, and we're going to take out the Madrigal card by throwing the beast into it now that it's healed up. Quest with the Rapunzel for 2, and we're at 7 lore, and the opponent's only at 2 here. So these Amber decks that focus on reanimation or like follow-up, like the Mufasa, they do seem very good going second. Like they're able to claw back a lot of tempo. So, they're not necessarily out of the game necessarily. They're going to put 1 damage on their Mufasa by crashing it into my character there to take it out, and that's actually really nice, because I can now drop this Snow White, quest with it, and get back the Rapunzel that they just took out. So I was waiting for them to crash or take out that Rapunzel before I was able to recur it with the Snow White, and this again just represents another draw 3 potentially. And then we ink and brawl, so we could have shifted for 4, or we did shift for 4 and still had 3 ink left over to brawl that Perdita, leaving them with Mufasa and the Pascal, and the Mufasa will likely have to crash into the beast. You could argue that the opponent could take both their characters and crash it into the Snow White, because that's how much of a threat Snow White is at this point. It just represents like insane amounts of advantage, right? Like this Rapunzel I have back in my hand, the opponent's at a loss here, because if they don't take out the beast and they focus on the Snow White, they know I'm going to draw another 3. Yeah, they're just in a really rough spot. The Mufasa actually misses and hits a friend's, and I was just like, oh man, it's just not this guy's day at this point, right? So he's going to end up dropping a very interesting card here on 7 in the new Ursula Sea Witch Queen, which stops me from singing anything. But again, we're not too threatened, because we are likely, drop a beast, drop a Rapunzel, draw 3. We're likely going to draw into removal, and sure enough we do. We have the Maleficent Dragon for follow-up later on. We quest with Snow White, get back a big body in the Beast again, another 2 quester. We're on 17 lore, and at this point, Snow White is just win more. Did it do as much as you wanted it to do, or was it kind of redundant? I would say it might have seemed a little redundant in this match because we did have control of the match throughout the whole way. But the opponent's going to realize there's nothing they can do, and they're going to end up scooping it up. In this next matchup, we're going to be going up against an interesting Emerald Amethyst deck. Not the traditional low to the ground version, which this deck does fairly well against, I would think, because you can definitely challenge and take out a lot of the aggro threats pretty early, again, with your overstated bodies. And then towards the mid and late game, you can just start dropping your removal options, right? You can sing Be Prepared early to wipe a wide board. You don't really care too much about the evasives because you have things like Brawl and Madame Medusa as well. So by the time they start establishing those, you should be fairly well developed yourself to combat the aggro strategies. But in this variation, the opponent is actually experimenting with like a Floodborn-esque kind of version. It is going to be focused around Bucky, and similar to what Steel Amethyst does with the Jafar combo, you're going to see this opponent use the new second star to the right, which can be comboed with the Ursula Deceiver of All to draw 10 and then gain 10 lore if the Jafar Striking Illusionist is exerted as well. So you saw them ink a couple of Floodborns there. I think they inked the Yzma. I don't remember what they inked on turn 1, but they didn't develop a turn 1, neither did we. And this was the build that I was playing with the Simbas, obviously, and not the Cinderellas. I know in the deck profile I did mention, and a lot of you commented, that you would want to play the version with Teeth and Ambitions and the Cinderellas because of exactly what you see on screen here in the Diablo coming down, and that represents a big threat. But again, if you know you're against Emerald, you want to aggressively mulligan for a Brawl. Yes, you could also play Teeth and Ambitions for extra insurance, and at worst it's just ink. And the Simbas, they're nice, but you may not necessarily need them because against these kind of decks that don't have a lot of threatening, like offensive pressure, they're likely not going to be able to out your Snow White right away. So you may not need the bodyguards, right? You want the bodyguards for like the Ruby and Steel decks that might be throwing bigger bodies into your Snow White, but it's not necessarily needed. Or you can maybe find a way to lower the ratios. The thing with Snow White is you can play a lot of like 1-ofs and 2-ofs potentially, like as a toolbox option almost, similar to what you could also do with Perdita to a certain extent. Anyways, back to the match here. After we brawl away the Diablo, the opponent does drop an Ursula Deceiver of All on turn 3, and being on the draw here, we have to constantly kind of react to the opponent's board. We're not going to be able to deal with this Deceiver of All, but them singing the Strike a Good Match with the Bucky kind of indicates that they're in a rough spot. And like I mentioned earlier, they're running a lot of those draw spells, so they're likely fishing for the friends on the other side. They didn't want to sing or double sing the Strike a Good Match with the Ursula Deceiver of All to discard 2. So instead, they sing it with the Bucky. They obviously have no other Floodborns in hand. That's why they kind of think the Bucky value is gone. They'd rather draw into their out. And I think that is a very heads-up play that not a lot of people would make. They would probably just sit there on their Bucky and then keep bricking with their hand and get further and further behind in the game. So good play from my opponent, in my opinion, to try to draw their way out. But like I mentioned, many times already, right? Like this board that we've put up, the opponent can't deal with it, right? The stats are too high, the strength, the defense, and their discard or their Bucky engine, it just isn't going to work against us all too well unless they get the busted nuts. They kind of almost did with like turn 2 Bucky, turn 3 Diablo. They didn't have a turn 4 or 5 follow up, etc. for additional discards. But between the Snow White generating advantage from the discard pile back to our hand, again getting us advantage during our turn for either ink or cards to play, and then us drawing into our healing characters like the Rapunzel, we're going to be able to mitigate, and in this case here you can see Surfer Stitch, we should be able to mitigate a lot of what the opponent tries to do against us. Now they do establish the Striking Illusionist, and my Medusa can't hit this, so I'm just going to drop it and take out the Ursula Deceiver of All to just slow them down from potentially singing a Friends, obviously, or a Strike a Good Match, which would represent 4 lore for the opponent off the Jafar. To out this Jafar, I basically need to get up to 9 ink and get the Maleficent Dragon, or do the whole Ariel into Be Prepared. But it's not necessarily too threatening either way, because I can easily just race them right now. They don't have any cards in hand. They're not on a whole new world, obviously, not being on Steel. Yes, they could draw into things like Friends on the other side, but right now with what they have on board, they'd be forced to sing it with the Jafar, which means their other 2 characters are not really doing anything on board. So yeah, we do drop the Rapunzel, heal up our characters, and we're going to be able to continue to quest here. Nothing to even bring back off of the Snow White. The opponent might be even afraid to take out my characters because they're just like, oh, you're just going to get it back for free off Snow White, more ink, more advantage. And this is what, the state of the game is. They're kind of just in a really rough spot. They do eventually find the new song, second star, and they're going to draw 5 and gain 5 lore. But thankfully, we took out that Ursula, Deceiver of All. Again, a lot of anti-aggro options, a lot of anti-emerald options in this deck, and you can have even more with the inclusion of Teeth and Ambitions. Although Teeth and Ambitions does not take out the Ursula, Deceiver of All by itself, so just be aware of that. But yeah, our board state is such that, we're questing for 4 between the Snow White and the Rapunzel, and then the Medusa, Simba, and Mulan are all questing for 1 each. So we have 7 lore on board, which means we could go to 19. They did get a full grip that didn't cost them their ink to, because they sang the song together with the characters on board. So instead of going up to 19, I probably just do a little bit of board control. I don't think they can win the game from here, even with the Jafar, so I should be pretty safe, but we're going to drop the Surfer Stitch here, and there's the removal piece in the Maleficent Dragon. So again, we're not in a rush because, again, we know that this opponent's board is pretty, understated for their effects here. The discard, as you can tell, doesn't matter. Like, if the Bucky is too slow against us, right? Like, we draw 2 or 3 with our healing cards. The Bucky can discard like 1 a turn with playing 1 Floodborn a turn for the opening couple of turns. So while people are definitely up in arms about like how strong Bucky is lately, you just have to look at what there are what counterplay options there are. And I do think that this deck does fairly well. Again, I could be wrong. Maybe in a really high level situation against a really, really good opponent, you just get absolutely destroyed. But from what I've seen so far, and from what I've seen people post on the videos, this deck has held up quite nicely against like red, blue, and emerald steel. And as you can see here against Emerald Amethyst in this particular instance, we're not doing too bad. Again, keeping that Rapunzel in the back pocket, knowing that it's another draw engine. We can always crash a Rapunzel potentially and get it into the discard, get it back with Snow White if they opt not to take out the Snow White. And even on 3 strength, Snow White, if people have to throw multiple bodies into it, it's damaging and or taking out other characters while they try to deal with it, because the Snow White is a huge threat. So the opponent throws their Jafar into the Rapunzel, and then they take out the 2 quests in the Rapunzel, and it's just like, sure, I could just get it back again with the Snow White, but I think the opponent realized it was game anyways, as we were on 17 lore, so they just end up scooping it up. So that's going to do it for this video. Again, the deck profile is in the description, where I kind of explain the deck in a little bit more detail. Obviously, what you're seeing on screen here is the version, similar to a version that I was running. I may have Cinderella's in this one here. But yeah, if you've enjoyed this video, let me know what you think. Again, this video was mainly to showcase the Snow White, since I didn't really show it off in the previous video, and the deck has been working really, really well for me so far. But again, if you made it this far in the video, thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.